Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the M3 Weekly Market Update. I'm Melody Wright, and I'll be your host today. I'm hoping that you'll make this show kind of your stop each week as you try to understand the narratives on housing and commercial real estate and how that might impact you. There's a lot going on at the moment. We're getting conflicting data, there are conflicting narratives, and then there are some that act as if that narrative is absolute fact, but if you actually start digging, there are a lot of questions, especially ones around housing inventory. So thank you for joining me today. If you missed it, I did not go to the beach over the weekend. Instead, I did a deep dive on some very esoteric concepts in the mortgage space. So these are things that you may have a friend who works at a mortgage company. You might stop them on the street and they probably wouldn't even be able to tell you some of this stuff. As a jack of all trades, which I've been my entire life, I always sort of work in one department and then fix something and then get moved to another department. So I have, in my corporate career, I've had many different jobs in different components of a corporation because I was always seen as a fixer. You know, if you had a big problem, a big process problem, bring Melody in, she'll get to the bottom of it, figure it out, get it up and running. And then by the time I got it working well, it was time to shove me off to the next broken place, which is how I somehow ended up helping to project manage our consent orders, our AG settlement, our CFPB national servicing standards, as well as our bankruptcy, and then went on to fix default. So, a lot of experience in this space, both from a corporate finance perspective, but then also operationally. So there are a lot of gremlins that hide in these organizations that most people don't even know they're there. And that's some of the insight that I can offer. So if you missed it because you were having an awesome Memorial Day weekend, having a lot of fun and not watching videos about mortgage, no problem. But check it out. I'm always a little amazed that people find this stuff interesting, but they do. And honestly, you should, because if you don't understand how the mortgage market works, I think you'll make different decisions than you would if you know how it works. And so here I am each week hoping to help you sort of navigate what I think is going to be a problematic time ahead. Comparing it to 2008 to me is not useful because there are some components of this that are very different. And as an investor and a homeowner, it's going to be important that you understand what's happening. So, hope you had a fantastic Memorial Day weekend. Welcome back. This week's post, I wrote about kind of what I'm calling wealth porn. And what that is, many of us, just think back to the first time you incorporated binge watching into your vocabulary. And in this sort of long post, I talk about that I think that binge watching was actually, it's a necessary or an understood outcome of coming post GFC and sort of all of the turmoil we had there and our need to sort of self-medicate about what was happening around us. Because on the one hand, everyone was out there talking about how the economy was on the rebound. And on the other hand, if you were actually working in these places, you were miserable. You were doing a job of 10 people. Nothing was easy. Technology was broken, unless you were in some super sexy tech job. But for a lot of Americans, it was just not a good time. And then, of course, the folks that just left and never came back to the workforce because they couldn't find a job. And then, the creation of our gig economy, which the underlying premise, in my opinion, that was sold to everyone is that, if you hustle enough, you'll be able to get what you want. And entree our wealth porn, which, and what is wealth porn? Essentially, it's all these shows that we binge watch, the Housewives of Wherever, the Kardashians, Billions, Succession, that, spend all this time showing us scenes of a lifestyle that most of us will never achieve. Interestingly, I think the underlying theme or moral is that you didn't want to achieve that lifestyle because of what it took to get there. And then also, these people seem very unhappy. However, that's not what most people take from this, even though they may be laughing at these characters or saying they are. There is an underlying sort of, you know, jealousy, not even jealousy, but just, a desire for this kind of lifestyle. And, I've had a very weird sort of career. And my first part of my career, I happened to be around a lot of these types of people. And I can tell you, it is not what you want. And in fact, I've kind of lived my life trying, to avoid having to be around those people because it is, there's no trust, there's no human relations. These people become caricatures of themselves. Think Michael Jackson, where there's no reality and there's no one challenging your understanding of the reality because you make more money than God. It's, maybe you've created some fancy tech companies, whatever. You become untouchable. People stop talking to you. And so this breeds all kinds of just craziness. But the idea is that we are addicted to a view or to the idea that perhaps if we hustle enough, we can have some of these things ourselves. But to me, this is a great lie. And so part of my Substack this week, I'm talking about, essentially, is this, with the end of Succession, is this the end of the predominance of this type of wealth porn? And honestly, I've cut off all my streaming services, and I didn't realize that this was happening this weekend. But I read an article about it. I had initially watched the show, a couple of episodes, but I was in New York for 9/11. I lost several good friends in the towers. It was just a little too, I don't know, close to home, and seeing sort of what I would call these questionable actors, sort of perpetuate this narrative of wealth and excess that just was on the backs of what happened in the towers. Now, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but it's what made me uncomfortable about the show. If you love it, great. I mean, we're all different. But, this idea that we're all sitting around as we make our credit card purchases, watching these shows, and how that's going to spell trouble for us is sort of what I explore in the Substack. So I would encourage you guys to check it out. I'm waxing a little philosophical this week, but I do think it's important to understand what we're consuming. So as we drive 70% of GDP through our consumption, what are we consuming? What advertising, what marketing that is driving us? And is it the right thing? And is it the best thing for our health? And I talk a little bit too, I kind of juxtapose, sorry, Succession with actually Eminem, and sort of, I kind of see him as creating the theme song for Gen X, which is Lose Yourself. But the song is all about, getting your shot, taking it, but also working hard and preparing so that you can take that shot. And it's very different from the narrative, from the messages that you get from some of this wealth porn. And, as a fan of The Fourth Turning, which is just an incredible generational framework on our recent history that I would recommend everyone read, it gives me a perspective of my role in what we're going through right now as Gen X. We were the latchkey kids. We didn't get a lot of special love, zero participation trophies, and we pretty much hated ourselves. I mean, that's Gen X. And then we just worked and worked and worked to kind of escape that reality, so much so that we didn't realize in many cases the individualism that was driving us and how detrimental that could actually be to our well-being, until we all kind of, I think many of us got there and looked either up are around or down, but we realized we were exhausted. And by the time COVID hit, everybody was hoping for another answer, which is why I think passive income, through things like Airbnb and long-term rental became such a focus as people sat there getting, for me, I'll talk specifically about me. It was the first time I stopped moving in years. I couldn't travel. I was so different. I didn't have to drive to work if I wasn't traveling. All of a sudden, I could take care of myself in a way that I had not done so. And it meant when all the music stopped that I was left kind of looking over what, the past 10 to 15 years had been. And I realized, what was driving me, it was questionable. And especially as I dove into macro, understood more about the Fed, their role, what they believe their role is, which is very different. I understood that this reality, that I was not doing myself any favors, and I was damaging my health for a lot of things that I just simply did not understand. And so as I started to gain that knowledge, I also felt it was really important to kind of get this information out to you guys. So a lot in the Substack this week. Again, a little bit philosophical, forgive me, but it was a holiday weekend, so maybe that's okay. So what's going on specifically in housing and commercial real estate this week? So we got FHFA and Case Shiller home prices today. They were both up a bit. Again, month over month, year over year. I've linked the details in my Substack. You can check it out. I looked at the data. I'm not concerned. I'd already looked at sort of my Redfin results, which are going to be ahead of these two indices. I'd already seen home prices kind of tick up, but this is lagging. Some of these indices, it goes back to contract signings in November. And we definitely know there was an uptick in activity at the end of 22, in the early part of 23. I believe that activity is starting to slow. I need about another month of data, but it looks like it, especially, and I'll kind of repeat this from last week, the cities where you had home prices increases, you also had sales go down. So I believe that it could be an impact of the denominator. My belief is there is a specific kind of demand out there at a certain price point, which is being met at the moment by these, new builds. And again, they're keeping that top line price there while giving all kinds of concessions on the rates, doing all kinds of incentives like maybe giving you, paying for your solar or anything that they can throw at you to keep that top line price where it is. Because if they do that, they don't have to mark their books down. Now, some of these builders, I've talked about this before, they do cost modeling instead of mark to market when the project is making 10% in margin or over. Now, but if they start distress selling, the project will be netting lower than 10% and they will have to mark to market. And that will create an entire cascade for many of these builders. So, home prices ticking up. Many want to see this as the recovery of the housing market. I don't see that because I've seen with my own eyes the inventory that's out there that nobody knows about, the pocket listings, all of this stuff I'm trying to, run down so that we can actually get a good inventory number of what's coming. Because right now we can only sort of estimate, and it's even difficult to estimate with things like pocket listings that never made it to the MLS where they list the homes for sale. They just went on Facebook. And this is something no one in my industry understands or believes that happened. And it's a big part of what was happening in 21 and 22. Additionally, we're seeing Facebook groups, we're seeing smaller investors use Facebook groups to do deals. So there's, just as with the banks and how social media impacted or kind of accelerated that crisis, social media here is also, I think, going to be something we talk about when suddenly in 3 months, inventory starts coming from nowhere. Okay, So that was a little long preamble, but to talk about these specific updates this week, listings for sale. Last week it was almost 48, I think, of the 63 cities had increased listings for sale. This week, only 23, but there were some notable ones in that. Now, it's a hunch, and I don't know. We'll wait to see what the data tells us, but this could be as a result of the holiday, the end of the month, whatever. I do think we're going to see increases in inventory continue here in the near future. So unless the consumer just is holding out hope through the summer, which could happen, but as I'm looking at more Reddit comments, if I'm looking at more Twitter comments, as I'm looking at things that people send me, I believe we are starting to see the distress, and it's just going to start snowballing here in the next couple of months as it becomes clear that gross domestic income has slowed and the wage increases we were all hoping for are just not going to materialize. Okay, so top cities with largest percent increase in inventory week over week. This is very important. I said in my video last week that Nashville is going to tell us a lot about the national housing market. And Nashville had the most significant week over week listings that I've seen since I started tracking in January. And that was up at almost 9%. There is so much inventory in Nashville from an Airbnb perspective. I just do not see how we don't see that hitting the long-term rental and then make its way to listing for sale. And I've started using Realtor.com single family rentals and started tracking those as well. I was just using Real Pages on the multifamilies, but to understand this picture, we're going to need those because we'll want to understand the path from short-term rental, does it go to long-term rental, and then ultimately does it make it to listings for sale. So Nashville's a big one for me. This week that almost 9% is unprecedented so far in Nashville. And like Austin, there's just a lot of denial about the reality there. Miami at 7.44%. This is another one. I'm doing a Spaces tomorrow. We're going to be talking about the insurance issues there that are just huge, and it's going to impact a ton of people. And recently there was a famous person who said, "I can't move to Florida. I can't move my headquarters because home prices are too high." Now, it was probably more of a political thing between him and the governor, but if he's saying it out loud, it means that other people are saying it. And just as sort of Austin has lost some investment because of high housing costs, I think that Orlando is going to as well. Florida. But we know that Disney has canceled that large housing project in Orlando specifically. Oceanside up at 4.60%. This is California. Not shocking. However, the fact that that Florida seems to be taking California's spot in these top week over week listings, I think that is important to understand. Rosemary Beach, Florida, this is close to Destin. This is a huge, if you're from the South, people, they talk about 30A. So this is what I'm tracking up at 4.17%. And then Fort Lauderdale up 3%. So the fact that this Florida inventory is coming on fast and furious, I think is important. And is it related to what's happening in the insurance markets? Maybe, I don't know. That's what we'll see. But I can tell you that the voices are getting louder and louder of concern around these increases in insurance and property taxes in Florida. So stay tuned, join the Spaces tomorrow. I think we're going to have a lot to talk about. We're going to have some great Florida natives as well as local real estate experts. So please join us. Oh, and notable mention, Coeur d'Alene, again, increase at 2.96%, almost 3%. This is when I talked about Phoenix and the spec homes as a swarm. What we're seeing here is very similar to, how I think once all those spec homes are finished in Phoenix, we'll start to see them come onto the market like a swarm. A few at first, then more and more and more. Okay, top cities with largest percent increase in inventory from the start. Right? Remember, I started this in January. Inventory was somewhat low at the time. However, the reason I started tracking it is because it was increasing in a time that was not seasonal for the increases, and it was unexpected by many of us. Not the ones crying about inventory, but those of us who historically operate in these markets. So top spot here goes to San Ramon again at 88%. I had one follower tell me, I think it was Chevron, someone left, big headquarters left in San Ramon, and he thinks that might have to do with why we're seeing so many increased listings. But honestly, there are a ton of high value properties coming on the market. And this is something else I talk about in the Substack this week, which is I'm starting to see in each of these locations luxury properties come on the market. And this is recent. So I think that you're starting to see distress in the super prime. And in many ways, I think we will look back on this crisis as the super prime crisis. But just like subprime was a small component of 2008. It was more about collateral in the banking system. So will super prime be a small component. But this is what's very different about this crisis. But as people from the top start to suffer, the people in the middle who provide services to these people, these super prime, they are also going to experience stress. Okay, number 2, San Francisco, not a surprise, around 75%. Coeur d'Alene up 71.24% from the start. Denver at number 4, this moved up from number 5 last week. They're up at 51.38%. San Jose down from number 4 last week, around 49%. Austin up from number 7 last week at about 44.74%. Hoboken down from number 6 last week, up 34.25%. Boston around 34%, Seattle around 33%, Portland around 31%. So we're starting to see names that are not California in the top 10 and names in the West. And I think this is interesting and important to note. Portland, Seattle, Coeur d'Alene, as well as Austin in there. And then Boston, I'm a little worried about Boston. I haven't spent a ton of time looking into it, but just finding out that that one company sold its lease for Fenway instead of trying to find trying to sublease it, that it was very shocking. I think it was around $16 million. So there's definitely something happening in Boston. If you guys know, let me know, comment, etc. Because I don't believe that their story should be that much about some of this new build inventory, but I could be wrong. Haven't dived into it. Okay, so I made this big statement that rent would be spicy this week, but I guess I didn't realize that with the holiday weekend, things just kind of didn't move, I guess I would say. Just not a lot of change in direction either way. So instead, what I did in the Substack is I put together the table of all the individual multifamily complexes that I track so that you can see the change in the rent per square foot since I started tracking these when I got back from the road in March. So this is a more recent metric. But what's interesting is these are all properties that were built after 2020 and have 5 or more units. And so the vacancies on these, the rent per square foot, and typical asking rent, that's all contained in the table in the Substack. Encourage you to check that out so you can kind of see what's going on in some of these newer buildings. But I can tell you that overall, an aggregate of all the multifamily properties that I'm tracking, they were down about 1% in price since March. And so I think the cooling rents narrative, I think that is going to persist. And that brings me to another section of the Substack this week on commercial real estate. And what I put together there is some views of multifamily in terms of current sort of occupancy in a lot of these cities. So this was a smaller subset. A lot of times many metrics are just tracked at the MSA, and then it's just certain MSAs, but kind of put together a picture of these cities where you can see, what current occupancy is for multifamily, and then you can see sort of what is expected to be delivered in 23 and 24, what that is supposed to add to the how that's supposed to expand the existing inventory. And I think when you look at those numbers side by side, you will start to, so you can also, another thing that I did was kind of look at it as a percentage of population in those cities. And I would say, the average is around 8 or 7, between 7 and 11% of multifamily as a percent of your population. And so if you take that average, and again, we don't have updated census numbers, so we're trying to triangulate, get to the data. But if you look at that, then you look at current occupancy in these cities, and then the expected inventory and how that's supposed to expand occupancy. I think you will see why I've been screaming about multifamily, because we are about to have some pretty oversaturated markets, which of course are going to create price pressures. And I do not see anything out there on an aggregate level that would warrant rent prices going up. The only information I can get my hands on is that they will be going down, and this will be an inventory story. And on top of that, I shared some of the things that I tweeted about last week. There's fires burning in multifamily. There are these people called syndicators. What they do is they gather money from investors, a group of investors, invest in a specific property or pool. And I would encourage you to check out that YouTube. This is an insider view of what's happening. Now, I don't agree with their tactics or even kind of what they say about the market. But check it out, because if you look at that in conjunction with sort of what is about to come on to the market, you'll see that the fires in multifamily are even bigger than many people even realize. So as I say each week, and I've got to stop saying it, but there's so much going on. This is why, you can't just look at rates. You can't just look at everybody out there screaming about inventory. Because most people, I can tell you this with 100% certainty, people in single family housing don't talk to people in multifamily. The builders don't even talk to people in mortgage. I mean, these are just very disconnected silos that when we're at the end of this, everyone's going to turn back and they're going to say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. We weren't getting the best data because of the surveys. There were all those delays in recording the permits. I mean, then you had all these people out there doing, multifamily construction, didn't understand household formation, had been pulled forward, blah, blah, blah. All these things that I talked about in my January article, they will look back and say, yes, that's why we didn't know. But they could have known. This is about putting the puzzle together. Okay, so moving on quickly here to Airbnb. So Memorial Day came and went. We aren't going to know much about it until we get the information from Inside Air and that Inside Airbnb, and that will probably likely be another month from now. Now, I'm hoping to get Inside Airbnb info for May next week. This is always so fascinating and so much great data. I encourage you to look at it, check them out. They're fantastic if you haven't ever gone to that website. And I'll be able to see, okay, what was the average price that people paid in these cities for their Airbnb on Memorial Day weekend? Because I've heard from followers and even my own experience that I'm seeing Memorial Day weekend seemed be a little muted. Now, I have family members that went to Europe. I have 2 in Italy right now because they got discounted, travel. The cruise lines plus, everybody overseas was selling all kinds of discounted travel for the summer season. And so a lot of people that booked their travel early, this is what they did. So It could be that these folks are all in Europe as opposed to being in, our local hotspots. We will see. Okay, so not surprisingly, then, most of the cities had huge decreases in Airbnb prices. And again, so this comparison will be from the Memorial Day weekend to, a weekend 2 weeks in the future. That's kind of the methodology that I used. I think what's also interesting are the ones that have increases from there, and we'll be watching those as well. So first, top 5 cities with average Airbnb price decreases from Memorial Day weekend. Rosemary Beach, again, was down around 53%. Indianapolis around down 52%. Sedona down 34%. Bentonville, Arkansas, down around 33%, and Las Vegas down 32%. Sorry, guys, it's been a long day. I've had a lot of meetings, so apologies. I'm not very coherent at the moment. Okay, top cities with average Airbnb increases from Memorial Day weekend. So this San Francisco at around 53.7%, Nashville around 29%. It's probably all those bridesmaids parties. If you've ever been to Nashville, you know what I'm talking about. Seattle up around 21%, Sacramento around 20%, and then Bozeman around 20%. And so these are average price increases for Airbnb. So it's been a busy week of data, debt ceiling, etc. I don't think we have to talk about the debt ceiling, but I am taping this having not looked at anything live for about 3 hours, so I could be wrong. If we do need to talk about it, I'll do a deep dive session so nobody's caught unaware. But thank you so much for stopping by this week. Please leave a comment or questions. If you have a deep dive request, please reach out to me. You can reach me on Twitter at M3_Melody, MELODY, on LinkedIn at Melody Wright, Substack to M3 Melody Substack, and then here on YouTube. So thanks for joining. I hope this was helpful. And if you have any comments or suggestions for content, please reach out to me, and I'll be happy to discuss a topic that I think most, some of these topics I just think no one finds interesting, but apparently they do. So thanks again, guys. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you for watching.